think architecture in general, and especially with technology moving forward, there's just so much that you have to learn. If we look at Greece as like the heart of diplomacy, then how does that building let people be in that one place together and flatten hierarchy and all of those things? So you can get into that. There is this idea that you have to be good at math to be an architect, but don't let it hold you back, because honestly, you don't have to be that good at math to have that. You can just be deeply artistic. It's interesting to me that the state of architects in traditional practice is fallen so low in terms of their work-life balance, benefits, salary, etc. I think in a way, architecture is primed for a big shakeup, is the way I feel.
This is my guest, Helen Lummis, a trained architect with a master's in architecture from Tulane School of Architecture and a startup generalist. After a few years of practice, Helen transitioned from architecture to startups, successfully transferring her skills from architecture world. And now, she is a career consultant helping other architects who want out of it to do the same. Helen joins me today to give a 360-degree view of architecture career, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. Hi, Helen. Welcome to Career Calling.
Hi, how are you, Pratibha?
Good. I'm very excited to learn all about architecture today, and also everything it takes to become one and things one should be considering while getting into this field. So it's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, let's get into it.
So I was doing my little research to look at the field of architecture and what one studies, and it looks like a very long education path to begin with. So let's start there. Like what it takes to get educationally qualified.
Yeah, it'll vary country by country, but it is a long road. There's a lot of school involved, no matter where you are. There's also an interesting concept I'll talk about here, which is licensure. So similar to, let's say similar, but not exactly, like the bar for lawyers, boards and stuff like that for doctors, veterinarians, etc. So there is a process of exams and other qualifications you need to have your license to actually be able to call yourself an architect. However, unlike the bar, etc., you can be practicing out in the world without having passed all of those exams. I mention this because one of the requirements for licensure is certain educational paths. And essentially, I have a lot of friends that work in firms that aren't licensed. They're not going to pursue licensure. Totally fine. Big difference is you just can't stamp your own drawings, and going out on your own would be a challenge. Things to consider there. And basically what you need to do is a couple different ways to slice and dice, but it's either a 4-year undergrad degree in architecture followed by a 2-year master's. You can also do what I did, which was a 4-year undergrad degree in something completely different. I worked for a few years, came back and did my master's. And that ends up being like usually a 3.5 year course of study for your master's. There are a few programs in the US that are a 5-year combo bachelor master's. Tulane has one of them, but I think that program is like less and less. There just aren't that many options out there. But essentially for licensure, they want you to have one of those 3 things. So you're looking at shortest path, 5 years of school, longest path is about 7.5. Yeah. And then after that, you go and work and you have to do, I forget the hour requirements, but it's essentially 2 years of work. And then you're tracking your hours in all of these different realms. And then after that, you can start sitting for your exams sooner. But it's a combo of the education, the hours that you work as like an apprentice kind of a thing, and then the exams themselves. So yeah, it's a long road.
It is, yeah. And the exams themselves, how many is it? One, or like there's a series? I ask because usually even for the field of medicine, all of that, it takes like many years to just clear those exams. So how is it with architecture?
Their group that controls all that's called the AIA in the US, at least the American Institute of Architects. And they're always, I won't say always, but it's changing. So I was able to hit a path where I could do it in 5 exams. Previously it was 7. I think that now it's 6. I've been out of the field for about 6 years. Things have changed a little bit, but it's not just one exam. It's many that you can take over a course of time. And I think you have 5 years, I think, still to do all of them.
All of it.
Yeah. And some people will just like bang through them and be done in like a year, but other people, it'll be scattered throughout 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
And the exam, is it mostly what you do at work and what you've studied, or you need a separate training for to take exams itself?
So that's a great question. I would say, depending on where you're working, you're probably going to be doing a lot of studying outside of the field. So I worked in a high-end residential firm, for example. We didn't use a lot of steel or really concrete because we're doing homes. They don't need all that structure. But then when you're going to sit for your structures exam, you do need to have like basic calculations and things like that you would know for steel. Also like how steel's connected and all of these things that if you're not working on projects with it, you're not exposed to it. So then you're learning that on the side. Yeah.
Definitely something that requires a lot of commitment.
A lot of commitment. It's a long road. And often those hours that you're working to, you work very long hours in architecture. Yeah.
Yeah, you brought up, that's a good segue for my next question, which is you talked about residential versus commercial, all of that. When I look at the degrees, it just says architecture. Is there something called specialization? Like a lot of other fields, you have specific specialization. It didn't appear like that to me. So how does people specialize, whether they're doing a residential single family versus a big residential complex versus maybe even building bridges and stuff like that? How does that specialization happen?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Often for people, if you have a certain passion, let's say really into bridges, things of that nature, maybe you'll do your thesis project or kind of your capstone on something related to it, but you don't have to. But maybe it comes up there because that makes it in your portfolio. It's easier to talk about to get that kind of first job out of architecture. And you'd want to be at a firm that maybe does a lot of that type of work. So some folks will know what they want very early on. Typically in the summers, people are interning at different firms. And I always encourage people like try out a big commercial firm, try out a residential firm, try these different firms to specialize. But the specialization really happens after school. And it's truly up to you. There's a lot of firms out there that do a little bit of everything. But there are firms that just do the one thing. So maybe it's hospitality, restaurants, things of that nature. You can quote, specialize in it. But it's not as, I'd say, specific as like a surgeon who's I only do X, Y, and Z. I've spent 20 years of my life working on multifamily housing. So that's where that is. It's more depending on where you practice that you can pick up.
And they can keep changing if somebody works like 5 years at a residential and easy to switch?
I would say that depends. I'd also say that it's easier when you're younger. I think when you're earlier on in your career. So a big example of kind of maybe some wins with that is like with restaurant design, for example, there's all kinds of code requirements of the space you need behind you to do X, Y, and Z, how you're getting all of the gas, et cetera, into maybe the big stoves and cooktops and things of that nature. So you can end up over time, you have a specialized knowledge in that way. And that only becomes more valuable as you build that. And then if you were to, have that and then go work on multifamily residential or just high-end residential, single family, things of that nature, like that knowledge isn't as important anymore. While people do support people shifting around in terms of typology, which would be the specialization, I would say as you get further up the field, it gets a little bit harder because people are probably wanting to hire you for the fact that whatever that code requirement is right off the
Yeah, talking about the code requirement, that's another interesting aspect of this field is that I've gotten some work done and then I cannot wrap my head around those city codes. I don't know how people who work in this field get that and do that in so many different cities. It seems like every city has different codes, and as it appears to me as an outsider, different levels of stringency. So how does that happen? Is that something that you learn on job?
Yeah. It's something you learn. You might dabble in it a little bit in school, again, depending on which, also within the school realm, there's a huge variety of what you might be learning. But there are certain things that are the International Building Code. But then, as you're right, each city has very specific zoning laws and all of these things. Typically, most of that research, while you might be exposed to it a little bit in school, this is where you go to look for that. It happens when you're working. In those first jobs, you learn how to go and look up this in the code, this in the city requirements, and all of those things together. But it's like a whole other level of knowledge. I think architecture in general, and especially with technology moving forward, there's just so much that you have to learn. So you really are a jack of so many trades, all of these pieces and how it all comes together. But it's ever changing for sure. And it's also interesting, like depending on which city you're in or what you're interested in, those codes, those regulations, like there's a benefit, for example, of using a local architect because they know what those things might be. I went to grad school in New Orleans, which was also can be a really interesting place, like older cities, how they use the historic building codes, how they preserve or don't preserve like those older buildings. In New Orleans, there's a bunch of tax credits. So you can also start to get to people, real estate developers who specialize in those things within their city to be able to make really cool projects happen. Yeah, you can learn. You can keep going. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah. But your license doesn't tie to a specific region, does it?
It does, actually. Forgot to mention that. Yeah. So you get licensed in one state, or you can get licensed in multiple states, but you have to apply. If you get licensed in, say, New York, and then you have a project that's in Ohio, you have to apply to have your license in Ohio as well. And I'm not sure I think it's an extra fee and things of that nature. But then certain other places like California with the earthquakes has a seismic exam. That's an extra exam. And so if I was licensed in, say, New York, then when I come over to California to get a license in California, I have to sit for that specialized exam. So you are licensed per state. And you don't have to retake all the exams in the other state, but you do have to maintain your license. And so, yeah.
Is it common, though, to operate out of state and things like that?
Yeah. Pretty common, especially if you're at a bigger firm that has projects all over, you'll do that too. Yeah. And I think
coming back to the education side of it, during the school years, are there certain paths? Do you have choice? And what are some of the typical paths that you have seen that people do and what it leads to?
So I think picking the right school is really important for you. And by that, there's certain programs that are known for being very heavy in theory. So it's going to be a lot of architectural history, reading a lot of critical theory on those kinds of things. And a lot of those projects can be deeply theoretical, like maybe not as much on the practical side of can this building stand up? You might be designing projects that are like out in space and really exploring and pushing the boundaries of whatever your brief might be. Then there's other schools that are a little bit more technical, like really great artistry. We're really focused at this school on how like we make all of our wood joinery come together and things of that nature. So I think the school you pick predetermines some of these. And then within the school curriculum itself, there's going to be requirements. You're always going to be doing usually a history class. You might be doing building technologies, sustainable design, like things of that nature, like a little bit of exposure to the how of everything goes together. But the biggest chunk of every student's life is studio. So that's going to be where you're working on your design with your professor. It's usually, I think that's at Tulane, it was 5 hours of credit versus everything else is 3. So it's very heavily geared towards studio. And then within that, there is choice. So maybe not at the beginning, everyone, they want you to start at the same foundation, but depending on the school, probably about years 2, 3, etc., you can start to say, oh, I'm really interested in outer space. So I'm going to pick this outer space studio versus this studio about climate change. So there is opportunities in there to play a little bit.
Tell me why history is important in this. Like, why do you study history? What kind of history?
Yeah. So personally speaking, I love history. I think it's great. But the reason you study it is, I think there's so many reasons, but I really go always back to history in general. Whatever is happening in the past has a very strong presence in what we're doing now. Is there something that we can learn? For example, being in New Orleans, which has all of this flooding and post-Katrina, all of these things, you can look back at the way that buildings used to be built because we didn't have all of the air conditioning and all of this stuff. And there's really quite sophisticated and natural ways that people would be handling those climate conditions back in the day in that location. So that's important to know that, I think, for where you are. But when you're studying that history, it goes further back. So you'll be studying similar to trajectories to like art history of what was happening pre-World War II in Europe, what was happening in that. What did people build in Rome? How are they setting those up? A lot of architectural history will start before ancient Greece, but then it goes into what was the point of this building and this history altogether, which I think is also very, at least for me, was always very interesting. If we look at Greece as like the heart of diplomacy, then how does that building let people be in that one place together and flatten hierarchy and all of those things? So you can get into that. Yeah. And then it's also nice, I think now there's such an emphasis on Western architecture, but more and more people really are looking at it globally as it should have probably always been taught. And that's nice to see too, because you'll discover all these like really beautiful traditions elsewhere that can then inform your design. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Those ancient architectures, it's like marvelous, right? Like it really makes you think, how did they get to doing all of those things when there wasn't that much technology? Yeah, it's amazing.
It's very cool. And also how people like using local materials, but it's also interesting to path the trajectory of an architect and what an architect was and what it is now, because it is arguably in some ways it's the same, in some ways it can be very different. But the architect really used to be like building construction, structure, and like architecture, all those things together. Whereas now the engineers that do the structure, we have very specialized people sometimes just designing our facade and how that's all going to work. It's just interesting to see how that's all changed. Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, that there are civil engineers, there are structural engineers, there are that specialization. Does it also happen when you start working, or is that a specific line of education?
So engineering is going to be its own line of education. I had a classmate who did her undergrad in, I think it was mechanical engineering, and then she came into architecture. But she was still also in that 4 years of undergrad, 3.5 years of just architecture. But engineering is its own discipline, very different. You'll learn in school roughly some generic, oh, I need to size my steel this way. Oh, I need to provide this much duct space. Just like very basic calculation. When you're in the field, though, that's really, you're going to be coordinating with the engineers a lot. Yeah.
One of the interesting things about architecture is there is this artistic side of things, but also I think some amount of math involved, right? So when you're in a high school level, who are the kind of student you think fit into this field?
Yeah. So I think, I'll be honest, I look back on my path and I wonder about this. I was never very strong in math. And I always loved art. So I was always painting. I was always printmaking. Like I was in the art room a lot. And no one ever suggested architecture to me because there is this idea that you have to be good at math to be an architect. And what I found, so I went and did art history, and then I worked in design, and then I came back and did my master's because I was doing design work within my professional setting. And I sometimes wonder if maybe there wasn't that idea that you have to be good at, then maybe I would have found architecture earlier. So I would say that there is that idea, but don't let it hold you back, because honestly, you don't have to be that good at math to have that. You can just be deeply artistic. Again, now with engineering, a lot of that deep math of the structural calculations, they're doing that for you. You need to have, I'd say, a level of exploration. Even when you're building a model, this is going to fall down. But all of that heavy math, you don't really do that much. It's a lot of, if anything else, it was very simple arithmetic is what you do. And you do it frequently, 10 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, 20 feet, but you're not doing this like deep calculus for the most part. There are places in the architecture realm, which we can talk about, that really can get into some of that stuff, but you don't let it turn you off, I guess, if you don't feel like you're good at math.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good advice. Coming out of the college, what are some of the work settings? You talked about the commercial firm, and we routinely see independent consultants with their own practice. If you could just give a very quick overview of what are the different work settings that people could be working in?
Totally. I would say that this is an important one to think about and to explore if you can in your summer internships. So there's going to be the really big firms. Those are going to be like your Genslers, your SOMs that are worldwide, huge firms. I don't know what the employee counts are, way, way up there in the thousands. That's one type of an experience you could have, corporate setting, clear paths of this, that, and the other. In the US, I can't remember what the market sector is, but the vast majority of practices actually are this like 10 to 15 person firm, or maybe 8 to 15. And that can be a really nice size. You're going to find yourself doing a lot of different things, which if that's exciting for you, great. Like I got to do a lot of marketing kind of stuff and marketing drawings and things of that nature, working on proposals in a smaller firm. You won't get to do that at a big firm because they're going to have a team that specializes in that. And then you can also go all the way down to working for a solo practitioner, just you and one other person. So there's a huge range there of what you can do and study and learn. I think the smaller it is, the more you're going to be wearing a bunch of different hats. The bigger it is, you're going to be in a much more controlled environment. So that's the gamut of what you would say. And then I use the word typology of like, are you doing commercial, residential, hospitality? And that's probably a big thing too. Within those big firms, they're going to have studios that just do interior architecture and have studios that just do this, that, and the other. And that can also be like interesting to you to go and explore that. Whereas at a smaller place, it's here's our list of projects and you might be doing all kinds of different things. Yeah.
And independent practice, what does it take? Is it usually people do after many years of experience, or does it have a separate licensure? How does that work?
It's a great question. I would say a lot of the people in my current role, I talk to architects a lot. And a lot of people I think that are happiest are people who work for themselves. And so that's just an interesting thing. What I've seen is a real shift, though. It's no longer like you work for 40 years, then you go off on your own. I have a number of colleagues from my class. I graduated about 10 years ago, I think, from architecture who started their own firm. And for that, you do need to have your license, or you need to have a good relationship with an architect who will stamp your drawings for you. Generally speaking, though, you need your license and you need to know a few people to get your first few projects off the ground. But I think it's a really exciting place, especially if you want to be your own boss, you want to run your own projects, you want to do it all and a little bit more on your time frame, a little just you and the client versus a machine over here that some people might react to differently. I would say the bigger firms, or just in general in architecture, it's a very traditional setup. And I think the pandemic changed a lot of that. But I think for a lot of young folks, it was that flexibility piece doesn't often exist in these bigger, more traditional firms. And so for a lot of people, it is, oh, I need to go pick up my kids at 4 and I need that flexibility. And a lot of places don't provide that. So I'm going to go do my own thing. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The shift that is happening in probably every industry right now, which is interesting to see. Coming to your journey, I see that you did 2 bachelor's degrees, if I read it correctly, fine arts and then history, and then you went on to do a master's in architecture. You worked for a number of years, and then you are you went out of it. So
Yeah.
I want you to take me through your journey and what
Yeah.
you learned along the way.
Yeah. So I have just one bachelor's, thank goodness. And it was in art history. So
Okay.
one bachelor's. And then I went and worked abroad for 2.5 years, working for a real estate developer, which also, if you are an architect, it can be a really interesting and exciting place to be, to go and work in the discipline, but for somebody else. And the reason I say that is that it'll give you exposure to a business and what all the different arms of the business do that I think can be really helpful wherever you might go down the line. And so it was a beautiful experience. It was really fun. I loved it. And I was like, okay, I want to go back to school for this. So I came back to school in the States. I picked Tulane because they had post Katrina, like a really amazing community involvement piece. And for me, I was really interested in architecture and how it can change the world, make the world a better place. And it just seemed like they were really doing a good job of that. I went to Tulane 3.5 years. I did internships within different kind of size firms. So about 150 person firm and then a very small residential firm. And one of those internships too, just as another option for folks, was very focused on sustainability, which is a growing space. We've got to do, I think, as an industry, all industries, we need to be doing more there. So that was interesting. It got honestly very technical for me, where I was like, this is cool, but I don't know, it's a little much. But it's good to explore all those paths. And then I worked for a few years. I did a light stint in commercial, and then I went and did most of my time in high-end family residential, which from a creative standpoint was really quite fun. But then at the end of the day, for me in architecture, I honestly looked ahead at what the next 5 to 10 years look like. And these days there's a 3D modeling software called Revit. And you go through this beautiful education in school, and I loved it, doing beautiful drawings and thinking about all these things. And then the practice of it, I found to be just a little bit dull, in all honesty. You just sit there for 9, 10 hours a day, not talking to anyone, working on your project. And for me, I'm social. I like to chat. I like to be doing things and just be out there. Like for me, being behind a computer, not talking for 10 hours a day is probably not my soul's happy place. So I pivoted out of architecture and I landed in tech very randomly as an account manager type person. And that has been the last almost 6 years of my life, has been 3 different startups, one that was acquired by MasterCard, always a jumble because I've been at smaller places. And I think that's a common thread in my career thus far. I like small places because you do everything. And always very client facing. And even when I was in high-end residential, that's a big part of that. You are with that client, no matter what project, for potentially years. So having a good relationship is super important. And so that's where I am now. And if I was to look back and say what really moved me out of architecture, it was the length of the projects and then just knowing it's 10 years of just getting all those skills that we're talking about. And then for me, I was like, I need my day to look really different every day. So then I went to the startup world, which is every day is wildly different. I joke sometimes I went too far on the other end of it, but that's the trajectory.
Yeah, at the beginning of it, though, was architecture always on your horizon, even from your early days, maybe high school or something, or is this something that you discovered when you work for that real estate development firm?
It's something I discovered for sure. I was always interested in design. I feel like a lot of young people, I really, when I was little, I wanted to be a vet. I was just talking to a friend about this earlier. I loved animals. I wanted to be a vet. I got into college and I wasn't great at chemistry, and veterinary school, also a very long road. And I just, and now I'm at a place where I'm like, that wouldn't have been right for me because I think emotionally it would have been really hard. But I always wanted to be a vet. And then I graduated and I was like, oh, I don't really know where I go from here. And I was lucky enough to have this opportunity that put me into the design realm. And that was really nice. But for me, yeah, it was never really on the horizon. I think because of the next thing, it was just
Mhm.
not put there. Yeah. So a lot of
Mhm.
people have that calling, if you will, ever since they were little, they want to be an architect. And I'll say I didn't have that.
So when you did your master's degrees, that's your first foray into officially doing. Since that you have been through this journey of going in and out of architecture, what were some of the things that you were imagining an architecture career to be? And what were some of the practical things that you learned on job? Like
Yeah.
that, could you contrast that?
I think what's really interesting to me in general to think about with the whole trajectory of education to practice is that I would argue that there's very few kind of school programs these days that really set you up and train you with what you need to learn on the job. I think
Hmm.
that's across the board a situation that has been happening. But I do feel like I look at, and architecture is often lumped in with law and with being a doctor because they're all older professions that have this kind of path of, I'd say, this apprenticeship path, and it pulls from those traditions in many ways. However, I feel like you're in law school, you're learning these legal cases. I know the practicality of practicing law is probably pretty different. Same thing with doctors. I think med school gives you that foundation, and then you go out and you do all of your residencies to start learning that. But I do feel like, you know, there is a huge gap between what you learn in architecture school and I think what you can find yourself doing in the practice at work, which is why I would say if you are somebody who is wondering about architecture, get an internship and maybe get a few under your belt because the day in and day out of architecture as a business is very different than architecture in school. You know, in school, it's all these beautiful questions of how is this engaging the community? How do you move through the space? What does it feel like? What's the light like? Like all these really wonderful things. Like I loved school. But then the practicality is like, oh, is this handrail 4 inches enough? Or can a kid put their head through there? How are we going to make this turn happen and maintain that spacing? What's the easiest way and cheapest tile pattern to be able to clean a bathroom? And those things are very important. But 10 years of that can really, I think, add up to being difficult. And again, I think a lot of that is informed by what kind of a firm you end up practicing at. But it felt very much for me like there was this stripping away of a lot of those beautiful questions to just, let's just get it done. What does the code say? Code's becoming increasingly prescriptive as well. So I think that's why you might see in the United States like a very homogenous landscape of what everything looks like.
Yeah.
Multifamily unit in where you are looks the exact same as a multifamily unit here in Southern California, and
Yeah. Very
Ohio
cookie
was the
cutter.
same. Yeah,
The
exactly.
question I had followed there was how early can one get an internship? Because it is a long educational path. If you
Yeah.
are already into studying architecture already, probably that's I've already invested that much time to get a feel for whether this is the line for me or not, which I think is a huge gap in a lot of the industries, not just architecture. How
Mhm.
early can a high schooler go and do some internship? Is that
Yeah.
possible?
Yeah, totally. I had a good friend who started in high school interning. I actually knew a couple people that I think, again, I think it's great because you really see what does the day-to-day look like. So you can start as early as high school for sure. You won't be doing probably like big crazy things, but you can be in there to help you with that. And I like struggle with this recommendation, but it would be like learning AutoCAD. And these days there's all kinds of 3D modeling you can do, but I still think a lot of schools focus on drawing in 2D first before you get to 3D. And so if you want to get into a firm and also be like useful or helpful or in there, then I think learning CAD can be a helpful starting point. But I'd encourage, even if just a week of kind of shadowing could be helpful. Yeah.
Makes sense. Now, you have also made the journey of getting out of architecture, like you said. Knowing the skill sets that you're developing during education years and your practice, what are some of the areas where you think you have transferable skills that you can take in?
Yeah. Great question. So this is something that a lot of architects could benefit from. On the side, I do career consulting for people who leave architecture. So I talk about this all the time. I think some of the big things that you can take with you, one of the biggest things is to get a building done. You're working with so many different people and you're coordinating information between all of these different people. Back to those engineers, you are working with them extensively. You're also managing the needs of the client. To me, that's probably one of the most transferable pieces is like, how do I take this information that's very technical, diffuse it and communicate it to somebody else, and also just keep the whole ship running smoothly. And that, I think, is a huge skill no matter where you go. Especially, I think that translation of the technical language into something that someone else without that background can understand. The other big thing, and I often encourage folks to do this, and this is more technical, but it's project management can be a really great pivot if you find yourself in that situation. And the reason I say that is you're also managing these huge project schedules. We have Gantt charts and things like that, which translate very well into other fields. But I remember I pulled up a Gantt chart in MasterCard when I was with them, and no one in their marketing department had seen a Gantt chart before, which was very interesting because in architecture, it's like what you live and breathe is this needs to be delivered on this date. We can't start this until this thing is done. And that's a whole other thing about order of operations. That's a huge skill that you can take anywhere. The last thing I'll say, and it's a very buzz heavy word right now, is design thinking. Everyone says, I remember talking to a friend who went to business school. She's like, oh, I'm a design thinker. And I was like, am I a design thinker? You are. So that's something to also talk about. But I think probably the biggest thing that design thinking to me means and what you learn in architecture is you see all of the constraints around you and you have to come up with a solution that works between those. I think that's like the big thing because in any business, in any realm that you're in life, you're going to have all these constraints around you and being able to find not just one solution, but multiple solutions and then figure out which one is the best one based on those constraints. That's pretty awesome life skill to take anywhere you go. So that's, to me, probably the most important one that's transferable. Yeah.
Yeah, my natural thinking was design as well, because you are designing physical world that has certain interaction pieces to it, and then all of that, which is done in a lot of software industry. The design is usually big teams where you need to have these kind of visual skills and then interaction skills. So that's what I was thinking. So it's good to know. Project management definitely sounds like a big one as well there.
Yeah. The other thing too, to me, that I find interesting with software is it's a very similar problem, if you will, of like, how are people moving through the space? It's just that the space is the app, the website, whatever it is. And that's why a lot of people in architecture find themselves really intrigued by UX and UI design. But it is a very similar way of thinking. What is that? But it's just no longer in that built-in. Yeah.
Is it a big trend, at least in the United States, for people in architecture to move to different fields? What's your view on that?
Yes, I would say I am seeing, I'd be curious to see what like the actual stats are, but I think it is a big trend. I think the reality is that architecture is incredibly grinding as a career. And I think I see a lot of people that really struggle with just a lot of things. I think in a way, architecture is primed for a big shakeup, is the way I feel. It's still a lot of white men who are older running these firms. It's really hard, I think, to have a balanced life when you get to a certain point within architecture. And I think that also, being very blunt, I heard this in school. Didn't matter to me then. It matters to me now. The salaries are pretty low for what you're working. And I think that is important. Like, again, I didn't really listen, like all your professors will joke about it, but it's true. The salary is quite low considering all of the effort and dedication that goes into it. And so then I think a lot of people end up being 10 years out from school, 10 years into working, maybe even just 5 years. And they're just like, I want to have a family and I can't work 80-hour weeks and I need to be making more than 85K. And so it's just an interesting thing where I do think a lot of people are leaving. And I think a lot of people are leaving because the field hasn't made big changes. And I think there are people who are joining the AIA who are trying to improve the working conditions. If you're interested, there's a move to try to unionize the field of architecture. And that's being started by a couple of different firms. The New York Times does some articles on it from time to time. But I do think it's interesting to me that the state of architects in traditional practice is fallen so low in terms of their work-life balance, benefits, salary, et cetera, that there is a move at very esteemed firms to try to unionize, to have more protection.
What I found interesting is when you were talking about the salaries being low and all of that, as a homeowner and knowing a lot of other homeowners, the feeling is not like that, right? Increasingly, it has felt it has gotten very expensive to engage the firms or the architects and all of that. So that contrast to me was very interesting that, it doesn't flow to everybody that works it. Do you have any comments on that? Why that happens?
Ooh, there are a lot of articles out there that'll talk about it, but it's interesting because I think I'll take a step back. What I think's been happening, a lot of people will say this too, within the industry is it's many years, decades of architects devaluing themselves and the work that they do. And what happens in, for example, the housing real estate crisis, 2008, 2000, all the work dries up. We're hitting a similar thing. It's not as bad with high interest rates. And so for architects to keep the lights on, they end up taking on work at a very low rate where they're hardly making any profit at all. And then you also end up in a place where multiple firms are bidding for one project, and whoever gets the lowest bid might win the project. So people will undercut a lot of times. So then that's ended up in this whole idea that architecture only costs this much, when actually the work behind it is extensive and a lot of firms are hardly scraping by. But then to the consumer's eye of, I want to get something done on my house, I can't believe it costs this much money from the architect fee. But I would say that there are firms that are keeping a lot of that profit. They might also do profit sharing. But for the most part, most firms that are smaller, at least, that aren't these big businesses like a Gensler, we're not making a lot of money off of those projects. It's like the bare bones. It might have a 10% profit baked in there, maybe, but really depends. So it's interesting where I think over many years, the consumer's view of what architects do is, I can't believe it's this much money. And actually, that's a discount. And you're getting that for free, basically.
Yeah, the two sides of the realities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Finally, Helen, for anybody, let's say early on, they have their heart set on architecture, field of architecture. They really love it. They may, like you said, they may be hearing some of these things if they've already started digging, but their heart is still set on it. What advice would you give them on going into it or ways they could make it successful?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is I know a lot of people that love it. They find it to be a deeply fulfilling career. They wouldn't do anything else. So there's all kinds of ways you can look at it. I think to me, like looking back on things, or the piece of advice I would have is that I think that the firm that you're with, especially I think the first firm that you take your job with out of school, and I hate to say this because it feels there's so much pressure anyways when you graduate from school, but I think that first move is really important. And I think being really true to yourself when you're making that decision of, where do I want to be? What kind of work do I want to be doing? What kind of firm do I want to be working for? Those questions are super important. And that would be my thing, is get experience at a bunch of different firms. And then really that first firm can either set you up for a wonderful path, or I think it can also really taint your experience. And so I think knowing what you're signing up for can be really helpful in that way. So another example is parametric modeling. You can really go crazy with that. And if you are really into that, go find a firm that does, and that's follow that heart all the way through. And that can be hard to do when you're graduating with a bunch of debt. You're like, oh, I just need a job. So stay true, stay strong. And I think giving yourself space too, finding a job, no matter what, takes a bit of time. And so I think that there's a lot of pressure to land something right after school. And I think finding the right fit and taking maybe another 2 to 3 months is probably more important than just taking the first thing that comes your way. Yeah.
Are there any forums or websites or channels that is your favorite to learn all angles of this field that you would recommend?
I would say Architizer can be interesting. The AIA, if you're really interested in licensure and things of that nature, take a look at that. One thing I forgot to mention is that I think it's called INCAR. There's within schools, the AIA, which handles the licensure, will basically say this is an accredited degree program. Make sure you're at a school with an accredited degree, and they come and review the school's curriculum every few years. But what can happen is if you're at a school or you see a school that says we have architecture, but it's not accredited, you're going to have to go somewhere else basically to get that accreditation to then be able to do licensure. I also know some schools will fall out and lose their licensure, or you lose that accreditation like halfway through your education, which again means you've got to go, not necessarily, but you probably will need to go somewhere else. So do pay attention to that when you're looking around. So the AIA has a lot of resources as well, specifically to licensure, because they that process. I'm trying to think, there used to be something called Black Spectacles that can be helpful as well. ArcConnect, ArcDaily, all those kinds of big ones. They'll also be sharing a bunch of beautiful projects from around the world, but also good resources to just check it out, find some local firms, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Helen. This was a really wholesome conversation that I personally enjoyed a lot. I learned a lot about the field, and I'm sure people who are considering this field will find it very helpful as well. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast and sharing all of this information.
Of course. Thank you so much, Pratibha. It was so wonderful chatting with you again. And I wish good luck and happiness to all folks as they find their way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. For more contents like this, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating, or a comment. Thank you for tuning in.